Okay, hi again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what we hope will be a really interesting, but also very practical session on gender inclusion in last mile distribution. My name is Charlotte Taylor. I'm Communications and Project Manager at the GDC, and I'm delighted to welcome you all today. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll first give you a very brief introduction just to frame today's discussion, after which I'll hand over to Value for Women, who will provide some insights on how and why using a gender lens can solve business challenges and drive business and social impacts. Today, Value for Women will draw in particular on their experience of providing tailored technical assistance to SMEs, highlighting specific strategies in areas like sales, marketing and customer care that may be of particular interest to GDC members. As always, we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, so please drop your questions into the chat using the panel at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to do so. I should also mention that Value for Women is currently actually working with 4 GDC members to pilot strategies like those that they'll be presenting for you today. And we're hoping that we'll be able to hold a follow-up webinar sometime early in the new year to explore the experiences of those GDC members, the lessons they've learned and so on. So do keep an eye out for that in the new year. Next slide, please. So at the GDC, we believe that our members are well positioned to help further gender inclusivity by empowering women as consumers, as employers, as social impact leaders, among other things. We also know that women around the world on average earn less than men and are more likely to experience persistent poverty. And so it's probably unsurprising that women constitute a significant target market for last mile distributors. And there's also a growing body of evidence, particularly from the energy access sector, demonstrating that female staff can be more effective at achieving sales at the last mile when provided with a supportive enabling environment. And in fact, some of this evidence actually comes from GDC members themselves, a number of whom have specific kind of targets or focus around gender inclusion and or women's empowerment. But we believe that the commitment and willingness to adopt inclusive practices exists much more broadly within our membership. However, from discussions with members, we know that there are also existing barriers that prevent more distributors from adopting increasingly inclusive practices. From the relatively high short-term costs that are associated with implementing meaningful change, to a lack of kind of practical and sector agnostic knowledge, guidance and tools that are available to support them on this journey. So that's the background today, that's why we're all here. Whether you're fairly new to this conversation or whether you're already implementing gender inclusive strategies that you're keen to ramp up, this session is intended to help support GDC members to achieve your business and gender inclusive objectives by providing you with some practical guidance, tips and strategies to implement in your own contexts. So, as I mentioned before, if you have any questions for our speakers, please drop them to the chat box as we go. And I'd now like to welcome and pass you over to Asia Troichansky, who is Gender and Business Advisor at Value for Women. Value for Women is a specialised advisory firm working at the intersection of gender, business and investing that helps organisations to advance gender inclusion. Over to you, Asia.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today, and a special thank you to Charlotte and Emma and all the folks at the GDC for giving us a chance to speak with you and share some of the things that we're learning. For those new to Value for Women, I'll just say a quick word. We're a global advisory firm, and we have in our ranks about 20 gender and business experts who are based all around the world. The principle that guides our work, and this is a principle that is increasingly borne out by the data, is that women are key drivers of economic and social growth, and women's inclusion is essential for better business outcomes. On this slide, you'll see some of the organizations we partner with. These range from companies to investors to development finance institutions. And what we do with all of our partners is we help them to advance gender inclusion alongside their business goals. Today, we'll be talking about some of the specifics of this work as they relate to last mile distributors. And for this, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, gender and business expert, Pramita Ray. Pramita, over to you.
Ramita, you're on mute.
You're on mute and we can't see you yet, so you might need to back up.
Yeah, sorry about that. I couldn't find the unmute button for a moment, but I'm going to, thanks again, Asya, Emma, and Charlotte, and I'm going to share my screen again for everyone. So here goes. So as Asya said, today we'll be talking about, what we mean by gender inclusive business and our approach at Value for Women. And essentially the business case that we see for adopting these sorts of approaches in companies' operations and across the board. After this, we will move on to some examples of specific gender inclusion strategies that we have either tested or have developed and are about to test with SMEs in various parts of the world. So when we talk about gender inclusive business at Value for Women, we're not only sort of focusing on the HR aspects, the usual sort of diversity bucket, but we try to move outside of the bucket and look at gender-focused challenges and opportunities across different operational areas and departments. This could, include sales, marketing, customer care, customer engagement, and a variety of other functions. So the different sort of target groups that we work with usually are at the organizational level, concern employees and management. On the consumer side of things, we work with clients and end users. And on the supply chain and distribution side, there are suppliers, vendors, and distributors, etc. Our primary focus in this approach is not just to achieve gender impact and impact around gender considerations, but also to focus on the business metrics and the business performance aspect of what we're trying to achieve with our partners. So today we will be speaking specifically to last mile distributors and where we see opportunities for them. I will be referring to these organizations as LMDs henceforth. So primarily we see two entry points for where LMDs can take action in this area. One is at the leadership and workforce level, so at the organizational level internally. And the second is at the market level, which is essentially in consumer-facing functions and operational departments. There is actually a third level entry point that we work with, but the reason we're skipping it today is because we don't see it being as relevant for this audience. That is for the supply chain, and this primarily concerns agricultural SMEs that we work with. If you're interested in learning more about that, please feel free to reach out to us after this webinar, and we'll be happy to share more information. So around the sort of first entry point and the organization and internal sort of processes and policies and aspects, we often see a gap, beyond the focus on, improving diversity or investing in recruiting more women and the processes related to that. We see other opportunities being overlooked in a lot of cases. And these are, around things like retention, performance, employee engagement, employee satisfaction and motivation, as well as, sort of more of a focus on solving operational challenges that employees may face, as well as things like, providing the kind of benefits and the sort of gender responsive policies that would help. The various benefits we see are in terms of, not just improving things like, metrics like employee satisfaction, retention, loyalty, performance, but in a broader sense, we see this having impacts and significant impacts for, things like sales, revenues, margins, and therefore profitability for the company. This is an aspect that I would sort of want to draw your attention to a couple of data points as in a sort of illustration and which sort of underpin our approach here. So McKinsey found in a report in 2017 that more sort of gender balanced and diverse executive teams actually have a sort of a 21% sort of advantage over other competitors. In terms of profitability, they sort of perform 21% higher. A similar study by the Boston Consulting Group in 2018 found a 19% increase in sort of performance, organizational performance due to a greater ability for innovation, where the leadership team was more gender balanced. So moving on to the market side of things, and here again, as we said, we're talking about consumers and customers. We often see that SMEs overlook the opportunity to analyze, study, and dig deep into the different preferences, sort of usage trends, pain points, and ways of engaging and marketing to different customer segments that are gender specific and specifically to women. This results in quite a lot of sort of missed opportunities in terms of sales, revenue, of course, as well as aspects like client consumer satisfaction, retention, loyalty, referrals, etc. We've also seen that there are opportunities to sort of achieve greater brand recognition and sort of greater popularity and the ability to essentially target more sort of markets by developing products and services that are either sort of specifically benefiting women or disproportionately benefiting women. So this obviously points to the fact that there is considerable scope to achieve sort of impact on business metrics by targeting women and women-focused customer segments. A couple of statistic points that sort of highlight and underpin this approach for us. Women, according to I think the Ernst & Young research in recent years, women actually I'm sorry. What was it again? Yeah, so that's, so this is a different point. I'm kind of forgetting that, but it's estimated that by 2028, women will sort of be responsible for 75% of all discretionary spending. And at the moment, women are responsible for the majority of sort of purchasing decisions globally, and as a result, sort of $20 trillion in sort of purchases. So moving on to the gender inclusion strategies and the sort of examples that we want to walk the audience through today. Again, as we outlined earlier, we will be focusing on LMDs specifically, as we think this will be of most interest to you. When we sort of work with SME partners in this space and develop sort of recommendations that they can then pursue, we focus on two aspects primarily. The first is the sort of potential for gender impact and improving gender inclusion across the value chain, the supply chain, and the organization itself. And secondly, as mentioned earlier, we strongly focus on business performance and business metrics for the organization and the potential to see improvements and results there. So what will I be covering today as I present these strategies to you? Firstly, I'll be talking a little bit about the business challenge, then the strategy itself that is supposed to address the challenge and the key action points. I will then talk briefly about the potential business and gender impact and results that the strategy can show. And lastly, I will talk very broadly about the sort of time and resource commitments that may be required of the SME. Just to sort of caveat that this differs, and from context to context, from company to company, and the time and resource requirements that we highlight are supposed to be sort of an indicator of what the SME can expect, but this can look very different from context to context. This is essentially a framework that we provide SMEs and partners that we work with to make a decision about which strategies they would want to pursue, and to try and assess what would be suitable for their needs and their priorities at a particular time. So on one level, we look at the business impact and the gender impact, and you can see here that we graded by low, medium, and high. On the other side, we look at the resource commitments. So here again, time, cash investments, and a third area where we like to sort of draw the attention of our partners is proximity to current business practice. So what we mean by this essentially is the amount of effort and potentially sort of capacity building and skill building that might be required for the implementing team in order to be able to implement a particular strategy or to pilot it. And what essentially drives this is how different the practice that we're suggesting is from the way the business currently approaches things. So, as a small example, if you're looking at social media use, it may be quite light touch for the SME to just, look at posts and see whether women or men are engaging most. And this is not something that we consider to be a major departure from current practices. We typically encourage SMEs to select low or medium, those sort of categories. And it also kind of depends on how much time is available for the strategy in question. So I'll now move on to the strategies themselves. This first strategy about data essentially underpins all of our other work. And we really emphasize this for our partners as something they need to integrate into their operational practices as a long-term approach. And you will see that all of the strategies I walk through afterwards are based on this sort of data collection, collation, disaggregation, and analysis. The different areas where we see, sex disaggregated data really having an impact in terms of the insights that it reveals about the business. Again, in the three levels that we mentioned earlier, organizationally, among employees, on the customer side of things, and also in the supply chain. So this could be related to a variety of things. And some of these I've mentioned: performance, retention issues, customer preferences and pain points. Around suppliers, it could be about quality issues and the frequency of supply, etc. So what this essentially does is to tell the business where gender-specific or gender-focused challenges lie, and if there is a difference that can be addressed through a strategy that addresses the gender aspect of the challenge. In many cases, we see that the SME already has a hunch or a hypothesis about where a certain business challenge is being driven by a gender specific sort of detail or point or nuance. One example would be of sales agents for LMDs who work at the field level, and where high turnover among women sales agents may be driven by operational challenges, for example, in terms of mobility and time availability. So what this sort of disaggregation and systematic data collection and tracking does in this case is to validate that hypothesis or hunch and to provide the data on which the SME can actually take action and base its strategies. This also allows the SME to measure impact systematically once the strategy is rolled out. So overall, we see very high business impacts and gender impacts for this sort of strategy. Time investment and cash investment is quite low, as it's often quite close to businesses' current practices in the data department, in analytics, and so on. It's quite low touch overall. And many SMEs choose to sort of adopt this before they move on to other more specific categories. The second category I will address is human resources, as this is often of interest to a number of partners that we've worked with. And as mentioned before, I will be speaking specifically to strategies that are relevant for LMDs in this case. So the two strategies that we've chosen today to share with you are around the recruitment of field agents and the retention of field agents. The first is about, sort of addressing the low representation of women sales agents in many cases in various teams and contexts and geographic regions. This is often driven by, things like the tendency of men in the team to, or managers or hiring managers to refer other men. It also ties to the sort of channels and outreach channels available that are used to contact potential candidates. And this, of course, leads to missed customer opportunities and sales opportunities. The reason we find this to be quite important, and the area where we see opportunity for business impact, is the fact that women are often more effective and successful in the area of sales for LMDs, and particularly in targeting women customer segments. Women sales agents often also have, some best practices and approaches that could sort of benefit the entire sales team as a whole. So the kind of approach we take here is to do that sort of research at the outset, analyze the data, and understand the barriers that women are facing. This is usually done through focus groups or surveys. We also sort of emphasize the review of training materials, training contents and models that are used for sales agents in LMDs. And we often find gaps here in the way that challenges and specific sort of skills lacunae for women are addressed. Based on these findings, we provide recommendations on outreach methods, sort of upgrading training or making changes, as well as other areas like providing support to women sales agents from the outset. The second strategy in this category would be around retention. And this is again, sort of driven by very gendered challenges that women agents face in the field in many contexts. Some of these are around mobility, having no access to personal transportation, high costs of public transport, concerns around safety, other sort of cultural barriers to movement, as well as time availability due to their care work burden. So again, low retention and high turnover leads to a lot of missed opportunities in terms of reaching customers and sales, as well as high costs around repeated recruitment and training for the organization. So the strategies we propose here, the action points are quite similar. A key sort of action point that may be quite separate from the recruitment strategy here is around investing in operational support. So whether this is, sort of reimbursing travel costs or providing sort of arranging for transportation in the field, we often suggest that SMEs, invest in slightly more resource intensive solutions. And this is why you will see that we've said cash investment may be medium here instead of low. Time investment may also be medium because this requires more sort of management and, for someone at the head office to oversee the entire process, and this could be quite long-term. Moving on from the human resources strategies, I will be talking about a few other sort of strategies that we use typically to support organizations and to help sales agents. The first is around, sort of improving the training approach and enabling skills transfer within the team and within the sales force. So the reasons for doing this is that we have often seen that women sales agents practice more effective sales pitches, are more typically have best practices that other agents do not. Or they're more effective in certain customer interactions due to certain sort of behavioral traits and attitudes. On the other hand, we often also see that men agents have something that women may not be typically practicing, a certain approach that may benefit the entire workforce if it was to be standardized across the team. And that could prove to be more effective in converting sales leads. So what we typically recommend here is to, again, sort of undertake a baseline analysis and research to understand where these gaps and opportunities and advantages lie. And then to sort of pursue a solution, a pathway that leads to a standardization of these practices across the sales force. And this can be affected not just by sort of developing standardized sales pitches and scripts, but also by sort of facilitating the transfer of skills through peer sharing approaches and training, group work, role play, etc. So again, we see high business impacts in this case, as it can lead to significant improvements in sales performance. The second support strategy, and I think we've already spoken about this is a little bit, is about sort of operational support and specifically for women agents. This is particularly relevant currently, around the COVID-19 crisis and some of the gendered constraints that women already face. We see a lot of partners talking about how these have been exacerbated in the field due to the lockdowns and other challenges. So this not only impacts women agents' ability to hit their sales targets, but also affects the organization at a higher level in terms of revenues and cash flow, etc. So again, if the business is in a position to invest at that moment in logistical support for women agents, we strongly recommend doing so in order to solve some of these challenges. Of course, the flip side is that cash investment required may be higher than some of the other strategies. Before I go to the other strategy buckets in this presentation, I just want to kind of walk through a few results that we have seen from similar strategies that we have implemented in the past. So this particular case study is from a project that we did with the Shell Foundation in 2016 and 17. The LMD in question is based in India and has, again, a sort of sales force in the field and in rural areas that consist mostly of women agents. So some of the challenges that women were facing in this context were around time availability, mobility, safety, and other cultural barriers as well. What the team did in this case was to invest in demonstration kits that women could use in place of the standard practice of having sort of product catalogs. And the second thing that was done in this case, the second action point was around facilitating demonstrations by women agents in more sort of public locations and strategic locations such as outside schools and at bus stands, etc. So in this case, we saw some really sort of startling results and beyond our expectations. There was an 85% increase in sales for the test group as compared to this control group in the case of the demo kits. And for the strategic locations and demonstrations in those locations, there was an overall increase of 73%. So just a caveat here, as I share these results with you, these are by no means sort of standard and across the board. It depends on the context, the region, the company, and its exact challenge. And there have, of course, been strategies and pilots that have not been as successful as some of these are. This is a sort of one reason why we really emphasize tailoring strategies, undertaking baseline research and analysis, and trying to understand the specific context and challenge, as this gives us sort of opportunity to achieve more results and impact. We do not have one standard, one size fits all approach to any of these strategies that I'm sharing with you today. The next bucket of strategies that I will be talking about are particularly relevant to the current context. And these are actually strategies that we have developed over the last few months and we'll be testing with some of our partners in this project. So these are around focusing on building up the social media and digital presence, as well as marketing and sales practices of LMDs across the world. So in a lot of cases, we see that the sales teams for LMDs are unable to sort of move around, unable to take on the sort of face-to-face customer interactions and demonstrations that they're usually used to doing. Since in-person sales activities have stopped, one solution would be to target digital platforms and social media channels like Facebook or Instagram. And this, of course, depends a lot on the sort of customer segment that is being targeted. So if it's a rural segment, it may be more about WhatsApp rather than something like Instagram or Facebook. And these are nuances that we take into account while working with our partners. The first step here is a really sort of low touch strategy. And this is about essentially analyzing current engagement on social media platforms and pages and profiles that the company already has. So essentially what we ask them to do is to look at their posts, their pages, and to see whether men and women are engaging on equal terms, asking about specific products, placing purchase orders or showing interest. Once we know about these trends in more detail and have done some analysis, we will be sort of working with the team to develop messaging that targets men and women as distinct customer segments on these platforms. This could take the form of a kind of a visual post with certain text or messaging, or it could be in the form of a short video or audio clipping. We also take into account the fact that this sort of content will be very different on WhatsApp, for example, and what is being circulated there from what is being circulated on Facebook and Instagram. So the main impacts that we see here are the ability to sort of raise sales awareness and outreach during a particularly difficult time. But of course, these strategies have a longer term potential for companies everywhere that are turning their attention more and more to integrating these practices in their longer term models. This also gives the company a better understanding of gendered preferences and interests in general and not just online. This strategy is usually paired with the targeted marketing and sales development of messaging that I mentioned earlier. And again, this is something that we're currently working on with a number of partners. This we see as being fairly low touch again in terms of cash investment and time investment. The third strategy is focused specifically on sales agents and their use of these channels in the context of LMDs in particular. So since a lot of women sales agents are facing sort of considerable challenges in mobility and in-person sales activities, we think that facilitating access to things like smartphones and platforms like WhatsApp, for example, for women agents will be of particular use. So this, of course, is again something that may require more cash investment. A company may choose to either provide smartphones free of cost or to provide it on a loan at zero interest, or to provide smartphones for the period that the agent is with the company. When the agent sort of leaves the company, the expectation is that the smartphone will be recovered. With that, we come to the final bucket of strategies that I will be talking about today. And this is addressing, again, the market level, so customer-focused strategies. Underpinning all of the strategies that I will be talking about here are, again, sort of very concerted and systematic research and data collation, collation, and analysis and disaggregation to understand what sort of gender-specific customer preferences are, purchasing trends, requirements for support, after-sales support and servicing, as well as a variety of other aspects of the customer engagement and customer experience. So again, we see here a lot of missed opportunities around improving the uptake of a new product, understanding how to market products to different segments, addressing some of the issues that are faced by customer service or customer care teams in terms of the amount of time that is spent on taking calls and addressing service requests. So the research that is undertaken at the start of this process is then used to determine the kind of strategies, whether it's in marketing or customer care or product development, that the team will then pursue. The time investment and cash investment can really range across low to medium to high, but in most cases we see that the majority of action points and strategies require low to medium investment. Customer education and post-sale support is something I've touched upon, and this is, essentially we see opportunity to understand the gender-specific pain points and service requirements or support requirements of women and men customers, which can be quite different in many cases. Based on this, we often suggest developing additional customer education information that sales agents can use at the point of sale, or even additional material that the customer can receive, such as a small pamphlet. This is often also, addressing things like differences in education levels, which are of course sort of cultural and deeply gendered. So women in some cases will have less access to formal schooling, and this might require quite a different customer education approach for certain products. The third strategy in the customer category is around debt collection and repayment. And this is particularly relevant for a lot of companies that operate on a pay-as-you-go model, especially during COVID-19. We've been seeing challenges around debt collection and debt recovery, particularly as a lot of customer demographics have been struggling with finances and income. Women in particular are often sort of have less access to a regular income. Their incomes are often seasonal in rural areas compared to men's. And therefore, this impacts their ability to regularly follow up on their payments. This has been exacerbated, of course, during COVID-19. And we see quite a lot of opportunity for the company itself to improve its cash flow by addressing this aspect. So what we recommend in this case is to undertake a light touch customer survey and then try and understand where the challenges lie for women in particular. If these are quite different, we then recommend trying to tailor repayment plans and providing other financing solutions that the company may not already have been using. Another approach is to see if women agents in the field in particular face any challenges in customer interactions. We often see that, sort of debt collection, conversations around debt collection can get out of hand. There are instances of sort of aggression against women agents, especially from male customers. And this is something that can be tackled in a number of ways, one of which is to train women to be able to handle and tackle these situations better. So with that, I come to the end of the strategies that we will be sharing with you today. And I will hand over to my colleague Asya for the Q&A session. We will be addressing your questions together, and please feel free to sort of add them in the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that presentation and those insights, Pramita. Just want to plug for people to feel free to ask questions. We had one question come in privately that we can perhaps kick off with. Pramita, what are the strategies for which you've seen some of the more promising results?
I think so far, Asya, the areas where we've seen most impact and very promising results with the partners we've worked with across the world are around sales and supporting sales agents. And I mentioned some of those results. We've also seen sort of very remarkable impact around tailoring customer care scripts for, sort of customer care agents and teams. So I would say these are the main areas where we've seen impact so far.
Great. And another question, which strategies are maybe easier to implement? Like which strategies, what are a few strategies that a company might consider? Maybe they're lower hanging fruit or are less costly or require a little bit less time?
So as mentioned earlier, the most sort of easiest strategy to pursue, very low touch and the lowest hanging fruit we can think of, which has benefits across the board, is to simply start disaggregating the data that you already have, tracking data and collecting it where you don't, across some of the metrics in different operational areas that we've walked through. This will show you where the opportunities lie. Other sort of low touch, low cost strategies, in particular at this time during COVID, would be around sort of focusing on the digital marketing and sales aspects. Some of the strategies working with sales agents directly in the field may require more investments and more time and more effort.
Great. Pramita, what are some strategies? Someone asked, what are some strategies for providing support to women sales agents to help this is sort of like a question around cultural constraints. What are some things that an SME to do to help families become more supportive of women sales agents doing this type of work with LMDs?
That's a great question. Thanks. And I think one option, of course, would be to work on sort of sensitization with a family or with a spouse. And this is a challenge we've seen in many cases. However, this is a longer term approach and it may not always be feasible or within the ambit of an organization's sort of what is suitable or viable for them. Another approach that we think might show results, so we have not tried this yet, is to involve family members who may have access to personal transportation or maybe more sort of capable in a certain cultural context of driving around in sales activities that are undertaken by women agents. So for example, if somebody has a bike in the family and is able to sort of drive around with the agent, that really contributes to building confidence in what is going on in the field, etc. And in the long term, we think that that might be able to change attitudes overall to what women are doing in terms of paid work in the field in this case.
Great.
I see another question.
Oh. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Sorry,
I was going to just read it. No, go ahead. Were you, please?
Yeah. So I think Bridget, thanks for that question. And you say that women in rural areas are often the primary caregivers for their children and the elderly. How can companies navigate this challenge in the context of the strategies presented? This is a great question, thanks. And I think one solution that we could recommend here is to find ways of working around the time constraints that women in particular have, instead of pushing them to sort of make time for paid work at the cost of these other responsibilities. So one way of doing this is to facilitate sort of sales activities in areas that are close to where the woman may be, so that she can spend less time. Another, I think, is well illustrated through the example I shared during the presentation of an Indian company. So in this case, women are able to access a larger number of potential customers in one go if the company can facilitate access to a more sort of public or strategic location. And this reduces the amount of time needed to go door to door within a community. So as you saw, this has shown spectacular results in certain cases in terms of sales performance. I see a question from Laura in terms of debt collection. So how do you suggest doing this efficiently with rural last mile agents, in particular differently than you would train them in? So thanks for that question, Laura. And I think essentially this would need quite a bit of unpacking through, again, customer sort of sales agent focused research and analysis to understand where the particular challenges and gaps lie. If there is a difference in the way men and women are able to are sort of approaching debt collection, the idea there would be to affect sort of transfer of skills and transfer of knowledge within the team, again through those peer-to-peer learning approaches that I talked about earlier. If women are facing certain very sort of gendered challenges that cannot be addressed by themselves or through training, we would suggest finding other ways of supporting the process. Of course, this is not the best possible or ideal solution, but in some cases, having a male colleague accompany the woman may, sort of allow you to balance where there are very problematic attitudes among customers, for example, that cannot be handled very easily. Asya, I see. Okay, it's the same question.
Yeah, there's a question of the SMEs that you've worked with successful gender outcomes. What are some of those common characteristics of those organizations or those teams? What are some of the contributors to success of an organization undertaking these types of gender strategies?
So I think for this question, there are a few things we've seen. One is, of course, the sort of commitment at the leadership level. If the senior leadership team and management is truly committed to affecting these approaches, we see that sort of percolating down through the implementation team and management in general. And this always drives better outcomes. Time commitment, of course, and in some cases, the ability to invest some amount of resources really drives things like the selection and implementation of strategies that have potential for higher impact. For example, the one around operational support by investing in demonstration kits for sales agents. So if an organization, for example, is not in a position to invest those resources, they may have to choose sort of lower impact strategies that would not show as spectacular results as these. Another key area is to have a strong gender champion within the team, and particularly someone who is quite engaged with the day-to-day implementation of the strategy and monitoring of its implementation. Thanks, Mariam, for that question, but I'm just going to go back to the one from Caroline. I'm sorry I missed this earlier. Do results differ in different parts of the world, and do you have any examples? There are no examples that come to mind immediately, but as I said, the results that we've seen in India may be quite different from what we see in Kenya or Uganda. And I think this is quite a new approach for us that we've developed over the last 2 or 3 years. So as we sort of move forward with more partners, this will become more evident.
And actually on that point from Mariama, it would be great to hear from others who have tried any of these gender strategies. Mariama, I welcome you to unmute and chime in if you would like to. And it would just also be great to hear some other voices, because I know that there are other experts and other folks in this virtual room who've encountered some of these challenges. Okay, great. No one wants to share. That's fine. Okay, well, feel free to interrupt if you have other ideas. Let's see, I'm just going through our questions to make sure we're answering everyone's.
There's one that's just come through from Kelly Azia on the chat.
Perfect. Pramita, you can see that one.
Yeah. So let me just read it out. Can I please ask you to unpack a little your suggested strategies for assisting the logistics for women to reach strategic locations? The challenge for women-centric models is often the incremental upfront investment required and need for grant-based funding to support our innovation strategies, even if long-term we know the business case will come through. Agree there completely, Kelly. I think, again, this sort of strategy requires a bit more in terms of a cash investment. If the company is not in a position to support something like transportation to a strategic location, this might require sort of attempting to find funding, etc. And there isn't really any sort of short answer or solution to this other than to be able to locate the money required to support this.
Great. Maybe more of a little bit of a devil's advocate question. A lot of these strategies are focused on what the business, and it's related to the conversation we were having earlier about the cultural constraints. A lot of these solutions focus on sort of what the business is doing, but I think Pramita and others in this discussion have recognized some of the real cultural barriers that we're up against. I think the question is sort of, what are sort of the chances of being successful when either family members or other folks in the community are not excited about women sales agents going out and doing this type of work.
So here again, I think this is something, Asya, that we haven't yet implemented with any LMDs, but that we have recently been suggesting to some of our partners. And as I said, I mean, other than the sort of sensitization approach and the training approach, working with communities and families on a long-term basis to change attitudes, one approach could be to focus on ensuring that the family sees or the community sees the sort of financial benefit in having this sort of participation in paid work and economic activities by women. So we've actually seen evidence of what an increased income and a contribution to the household income can do in the Indian context, not with the organization I discussed, but with another one. And this is in the agricultural value chain. So in this case, there were some sort of operational support models that were implemented. And with that, women farmers' incomes monthly actually doubled. As a result, we saw families becoming more supportive. In many cases, decision-making power around finances within the household moved more towards women who earlier may not have had as much of a say in financial decisions. So I think it's really about, sort of prioritizing and being quite practical about what may work and what may not. Sensitization and training is great, but it may not always be sort of feasible for an SME, or it could be a much longer term sort of attitudes change approach.
Great, and maybe one more. Thanks folks for some of the comments that are coming in as well. Maybe one more. Oh, did someone unmute themselves to say something? Or maybe that was an accident. Maybe one last question, unless any others come in, which is, in your experience, Pramita, and in some of the work of Value for Women, what role does Value for Women or a similar organization typically play in helping companies implement these strategies? And what of this do you think companies could do on their own? Like, what might they be able to run with?
Great question. Thanks, Asya. And I think essentially what we do is not so much to actually implement the pilots or work in the field with the SME as typical consultants would do. But what we tend to do is to support the entire process and advise, sort of primarily supporting the research analysis, providing recommendations and ideas for strategies, action points, and also helping with the troubleshooting. So we typically keep ourselves engaged with the SME and a key liaison point at the company over the course of the pilot. So, several months or more. And we ensure that we get on calls or, exchange notes over email, every week or at least once in 2 weeks. So we stay as involved as possible without actually going to the field. And when it comes to actually tracking impact, again, we're very systematic in working with the company to ensure that they have the tools necessary, not just for the baseline analysis and assessment, but also for ongoing data collection to assess metrics, assess impact against key indicators and metrics that are established at the start. So whether there's a change in sales performance, whether there is a change in attitudes, etc. This is something we track systematically throughout the pilot. And at the end of the pilot, we typically do a sort of end-line analysis, and that we work together with the team for. A lot of our support, as you know, is remote. That is quite kind of our model. But we always try to meet the team at least once or twice, especially at the beginning of the partnership. As a result of COVID-19, this is not currently possible, and all of our support has gone online. But we will hopefully be able to return to more sort of in-person engagement afterwards. What companies can do without a VFW, I would say, just the data disaggregation, collection, collation, tracking is quite easy to do. And a company can, already often has a sense intuitively of which metrics and which indicators need to be tracked, which data points need to be looked at in order to validate a certain sort of conception of what the problem might be, where the gender angle may lie. So this is something we would suggest doing. And based on that analysis, it is possible to come up with solutions and things to test and ideas. Of course, having sort of expert support or advisory support available from a firm like ours is always helpful, as we have considerable experience of this sort of approach and can support companies in trying them out if it's quite new. So Leila says, is there any available gender analysis tool you would suggest to be more adapted to LMD businesses? Thanks for that question, Leila. And I think we typically use, we have a questionnaire, a survey, and some data collection tools that we modify to suit the needs of specific businesses. But we don't have a standard gender analysis tool or data collection tool for any of these specific operational aspects or strategy areas. We adapt them from context to context, from business to business, and for each partner separately, based on their business model, their context, and their challenges and priorities. I hope that answers your question. But if that, if you were meaning something else, please do sort of, I'm happy to address that as well.
We do, we are actually, so we've been working for, it's true, we do work sort of to create customized tools as we partner with companies to undertake these types of strategies. We have been for a few years as an organization working towards a tool that helps SMEs. It's not tailored to LMDs exclusively, but it is for SMEs, and the questions are different depending on the sector that you're in. And it helps an organization diagnose its level of gender inclusivity. What are the strengths and what are the gaps and opportunities from a gender lens and from a business lens? We're actually in the process of making that tool public and putting it online and offering it as a public good. We can keep the GDC posted so that when that goes live, hopefully in a few months, we can share that with members, and hopefully that can be a useful resource again to help identify some of the gaps and potential solutions SMEs might consider. Great.
Yeah,
yeah, I think this is a lovely note to end on. And with that, we would love your feedback on this presentation. So I'm going to launch a poll that I'll kindly ask folks to take a minute to complete. You should now see it on your screen, so we'll give everyone a minute. Great, just another 20 seconds. I see the responses continuing to trickle in. Okay, I see about half of you have voted, so apologies for anyone who's disenfranchised, but I will share the results now just so folks could see it. And really interesting results. Support to women sales agents seems to be among the more interesting, compelling strategies for people, with several expressing interest in gender inclusion in HR, digital marketing, and other customer-facing strategies that target women. And in terms of needs to implement these strategies, just a copy of the PowerPoint, that's definitely something that we could facilitate. Some further details on operationalizing. That'll come as part of the PowerPoint, where we'll include more details in the deck that gets uploaded. And we'll also share a slide in a second that you'll see as part of the deck with some links that you'll be able to access of reports with some helpful information and some more details on operationalizing, and then technical assistance and financial resources. Great. Okay. So just to close then, you'll see when you get this, when you receive this deck, Pramita, if you can just move to the next slide. You'll see, if you're interested in learning more, that we'll provide links to relevant publications. We won't get into those now for the sake of time, but you can learn more, and you can always feel free to contact us if you have any questions or want to learn more about this work or about Value for Women. Thank you so much for joining us and for your comments and your questions. Again, we're really excited to be working with you and with the GDC. And with that, I'll pass it over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Azria and Pramita, very much for a really jam-packed session. I will just whiz through this because I know that we are to time. But as you just said, we'll be sharing the recording as well as the slide deck with you in the next couple of days, so you can refer back to that. I already mentioned at the beginning that we're hoping to hold kind of a part 2 of this webinar with the GDC members who are currently receiving technical assistance from Value for Women. So this will be an opportunity to hear directly from them how they've kind of taken the frameworks and strategies that you've heard about today and adapted them and implemented them in their own contexts, and all about the lessons and impacts that they've achieved. And just really quickly before we wrap up, I wanted to flag that we've got some upcoming interactive workshops on credit risk management coming up at the end of this month, so on the 27th and 29th of October. These are 3 interactive workshops, in fact, and they're going to be delivered in partnership with CGAP and the Frankfurt School for Finance and Management. They are for GDC members. You should have already received an email from us about registering, but if you haven't received that and you're interested, then please just get in touch. So thank you so much again to everyone for coming along. Thanks to Value for Women. And with that, I think we'll say goodbye. Apologies for running over slightly.